In 1889, on a windy little island, halfway between New Zealand and Antarctica, a supervillain began boiling penguins. The man's name was Joseph Hatch. He was a known poacher, a ruthless capitalist, and a drug merchant. Up until now, Hatch had made his money dealing in powdered bone, seal oil, blubber, and other animal parts. But now, with the invention of a new type of boiler, he found he could extract oil from smaller animals, friendlier animals, animals who hadn't developed a fear of humans yet. The machines Hatch used were called steam digesters. Imagine huge cylindrical pressure cookers, like heavy rusted vats, where hundreds of penguins could be rendered down into oil to the tune of 1,000 royal penguins per day per digester. The island Hatch chose to decimate was Macquarie Island, because Hatch had discovered that whales and seals took time and effort to hunt. They had to be killed, carved up, and carted back to the boilers. Penguins, on the other hand, were easier to handle, friendlier. They could be herded toward the boilers live, then clubbed and loaded. When Joseph Hatch sold his penguin oil, he found it to be highly lucrative, but also highly unpopular. In fact, Joseph Hatch's Penguin Massacre started a campaign to defend the penguins, but not just any campaign, the first ever international PR campaign to stop the murder of endangered species. That's how villainous Joseph Hatch was, even in his own time. And yet, Joseph kept on boiling. He found himself again and again defending his action to the public, to Parliament, and to the courts. I think it's safe to say Joseph Hatch knew he was the villain of this story. You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Laments, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no-duh on the internet and get to the juicy facts about evil.
Does it pay to be the bad guy? That's the question we're asking today. With politics in corporate America, it sure seems like being ruthless, villainous, or just plain nasty really wins big in the long term. And most high-earning CEOs readily admit to having tempers or being outright ruthless when they need to be. We're looking at you, Jeff Bezos. To get to the bottom of what it takes to win, we're looking at 3 of our closest held myths. Myths that might be too optimistic to be true. Myth 1. Happy people live longer, more fulfilling lives. I mean, countries have happiness indexes for a reason, right? Myth 2. Good people make just as much money as jerks, and not all rich people are assholes. Myth 3. Can a rich supervillain like Joseph Hatch be reformed? Put it another way, could we pull a Scrooge on Jeff Bezos or reform any rich a-hole? But first I want to talk to you about how we arrived at this episode and how long Joe has been telling this story about these boiling penguins. How many years have you... I'll tell you why. Because he'll lead the conversation with this and say, hey, have you heard about this? And these are people that don't know him, so they probably think he's crazy.
Yeah, if I'm at a bus stop for too long and there are people who are not listening to their headphones, I will start telling them about penguin boilers. I first read about this in, I think, an Atlas Obscura article. And then even better, I don't plug a lot of other people's podcasts here, But if anyone hasn't heard it, there's a fantastic dollop episode with Dave Anthony and Gareth Reynolds. We're going to talk about Joseph Hatch, the villain, but they do a fantastic episode about what happens on Macquarie Island, and it is pure unbridled horror movie. It's just animal horror as they sort of hunt down the cutest animals on Earth and boil them and cut them up.
And we talked about it off air. We're talking about if we could, we would bring these people back to life so we could kill them for all the meanness, nastiness thing they did.
Right, we would boil them into oil, and the public would be fine with it, I swear.
And digest them in a digester.
Right. I love that name. We were talking about this earlier. The name digester. If they had just said boiler or vat, it would have been fine.
It feels like it's pulling you apart slowly, killing you slowly and painfully.
Yeah, digester. That's so gross. That's like a Star Wars creature. Like that's the Sarlacc, basically.
I'm going to threaten somebody. I'm not just going to eat you. I'm going to digest you.
I'm going to digest you. Yeah, that's a threat you get at the bar. So we want to talk about the digester a little bit before we get into our main topic, which is does it pay to be a villain? Because I suspected it might before we got into the research. But first, I want people to really understand how dangerous these boilers were, the digester. So, Todd, how many penguins is too many penguins to boil all at the same time? How many do you imagine these digesters could do?
I don't know, 30, 50 at a time?
I thought these were... Oh, you can... By the way, anyone listening to this episode, we'll probably have this in the podcast episode information and links. The digesters, the pictures of them, you can see them because they're still on Macquarie Island, and they're old and rusty, and they're sitting on the beaches. My screen background at work, I swear to God, is a crowd of penguins around these rusty digesters.
Well, they were made originally for elephant seals and bigger.
Totally.
Yeah.
So that's perfect point. So for elephant seals and large animals, each boiler was made to be 17 cubic meters, which means they never did this. Just letting you know, this isn't getting into body horror, but that means technically you could fit 6 humans into 1 cubic meter, which means about 15 people's mass could be fit into 1 cubic meter if you chopped them up or if they were in liquid mass.
It's a lot of penguins.
So theoretically, one digester could fit about 102 cramped people or 255 mashed people. So again, that's a bit of horror. We're just talking volumes and masses, but that means thousands of penguins. We set up top that one boiler would do about 1,000 penguins a day, and that's just because these were like being stacked in like cordwood. So after we know the volume one of these digesters could handle, I'm going to ask Todd, how many did they actually kill in total? Like how bad was this penguin apocalypse?
Keep in mind there were seasons, and they were sometimes working by the law, most of the time not. 3 million penguins over 30 years.
That is so many penguins.
It is. And they picked one that was not the biggest penguin, because you think you'd pick the biggest ones because you want volume, right?
Right.
But they picked the most plentiful ones, which were the royal ones.
Okay. So the one that became endangered because of this.
Absolutely. It's flirting with extinction.
Okay, and the one we see on TV that is that we usually see, that's an emperor penguin, right?
Yeah, it's not the common one that we're used to in all the movies and everything.
Okay,
but it's still a damn cute bird.
Okay, and did Hatch? How much heat did he get over this?
He was in and out of court, so he killed 3 million penguins over 30 years.
Okay,
he was in and out of court for 30 years.
Okay, so the whole time he's doing this.
Absolutely. He was in and out. And he was an interesting guy. So he goes to court, and he was a gifted public speaker. He was a successful businessman. He was a chemist. He was a mayor. He'd done a lot of things. But he had two, and this is kind of funny, he had 2 things that he was his big talking points. And one was Old Testament fear, that God gave us animals to use for our purpose. It's God's will.
Okay.
So that appeals to a lot of the Christian, conservative Christian. And the other one was, guess what, Joe? Jobs, our economy. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it?
He's creating jobs with the penguin boilers.
Exactly. So he was a pretty crafty guy.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to say I'm going to get on board with the penguin killer, but I can totally see those arguments working.
Every time he went to court, there was always huge crowds that came. So anytime he was in trouble, half of the people came to boo him, another half came to listen to him speak. I guess he was this real herky-jerky, but very smart and very witty. And so it was like an event. It was some real entertainment.
I would go to that. Like you say that, and we kind of laugh, like ha ha ha. People are going to go see the crazy man defend his penguin boilers. But if you knew he was good at talking, wouldn't you go see that guy? Like the mad villain is going to be in your local court defending himself. Let's go.
And 50% of the people want him hung right then.
Right.
Put in one of his digesters, and the other want to be on his side. He was very good at painting a picture, a vision of how economic, how rich their island could become if they listened to him.
Okay. It's hard to turn down a vision, I think. So, I mean, this is a ridiculous question, but back then, theoretically, knowing yourself, knowing your own mind, do you think you could have sided with Hatch?
Never, ever.
Penguin boiling is too much.
No, I'm just too much of an animal lover. I could boil people, more likely.
Yeah.
It'd be way easier for me. And I have a list of people that I'd put in first.
Yeah. Usually when we read history articles, I usually side with the public because I think to myself, times were different. Of course, I probably would have agreed with the craziness we're reading about. But with Hatch, because so many people were against him and publications went against him, I think everyone recognized how much of a villain this guy was. So, can we talk a little bit about evil now?
Please. Darker than we've already gotten.
Right. How dark can we make this podcast? So before we started this, did you believe in sort of, or at least suspect in your life, that villainous people prospered more? Have you ever had bad bosses that make you think, if I could just be that evil? Yeah,
that they just cut everyone's throat, stabbed everyone in the back, and now I'm working for them.
Yeah. I mean, Disney and stories try to teach us that they will get their comeuppance, that they can't possibly prosper in the long run, but
not in real life. In real life, they go to bed and sleep like a baby.
Right. They sleep like a baby after they swim in their own pool, and then it seems unfair. So we went and we dug out the research. We want to know, do miserable people live longer? Do they live better lives? We had an episode called Polar Opposite Collaborators, and in that we briefly talked about, does it pay to be the bad guy in the boardroom if you can yield results, if being the bad guy gets results? And I'm starting to kind of see a pattern here, that possibly being the bad guy in very narrow circumstances can get you results. So first off, we're hearkening to a article from the BBC called it's BBC Future, Why It Pays to Be Grumpy and Bad-Tempered. So that title alone probably tells you where we're headed with this episode. So, Todd, do you have? You don't have to reveal too much, but do you ever have anger problems?
Yes, I do. Not as many as I used to. I used to have a real problem with it.
So, in what way did it manifest? Is it seething anger or is it quick-tempered anger?
I call it monkey mad.
Okay, so it's quick.
And a lot of it's internal, but yeah.
Okay.
It's not a pretty thing. It's not something I'm proud of. It's something I've worked on. But it's still there. I still can get monkey mad sometimes.
Okay, so yeah, thrash around and yeah, the what is it, the pot boiling or the
yeah, exactly, the angry Irishman look.
Right, boiled over, a potato head turning red. I get the other way. I have the slow anger. Like I will feel offended by somebody at like a cocktail party, or somebody will cut me off, and then just over the course of several days, I will start building a grudge. So
just hating them.
Yeah. So our first key point to being evil. Evil people generally show a lot of aggression and anger. So anger, can it be good for you? This BBC article talked about how angry people have an easier time discriminating between weak and strong arguments. So when you see articles about Jeff Bezos getting angry and yelling at his team and calling them names, or you see articles about the guy that leads Facebook, Zuckerberg, getting irate or saying snooty things, turns out when you get angry, you can. It's easier to discriminate as a decision maker over people who have neutral moods. There was also a meta-study on anger looking at incidences of cancer and cardiovascular disease and asthma and diabetes, and they found that people are at higher risk when they repress, when they're called repressed copers for their anger.
So it's better to blow your top than to hold it in and be the more mature, emotionally intelligent one.
Right. So we're looking across the table right now, and Todd just revealed that he is a quick-to-anger, monkey-mad, blow off the steam and it's gone. Apparently that is more healthy for you than what I do. I am boiling. I'm not just boiling steam here and getting mad over the course of several days. I am boiling and building cancer.
So listeners, which one are you? You got to be in one or the other. So don't say you never get mad, because
right.
We know you're lying.
Yeah, so when you get angry, it's apparently better. And again, there's a lot of self-awareness that goes into it. You need to know what's a healthy place for you to express anger and a healthy way for you to express anger. Don't go punching holes in walls, and don't scream at your spouse. But repression is not good, generally, is the takeaway for this article. Now we get to another side of being evil, which is most evil people are portrayed as being cynical. Also, a lot of humans are portrayed as being cynical. You don't have to be angry and evil. You don't have to be cynical and evil. You can be just angry or just cynical. But these are traits that come with evil in the zeitgeist, the way we see things. So cynics. Todd, do you consider yourself to be a cynical person?
I don't, but as I'm getting older, it's starting to creep. And from hanging out with you,
I was about to say, I don't know if that's age or just knowing me.
You made me more cynical. I used to be Mr. There are, it's all roses and have a great day. Now I'm thinking, well, I don't know.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for someone that is not cynical, that recognizes the value of happiness, the value of enjoying what they have. But if you are cynical, or if you're starting to have some of that creep in, it can serve you as long as you don't let it take over.
Do you consider yourself more of a cynic?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a very positive thinker, but that comes after cynicism. I have to choose positivity. I start with, my baseline is cynic.
Is measuring. Is
yes.
Protecting yourself from.
Exactly. It's always, I plan for the worst. I plan for I wish I could use the word plan, actually. It's more like my instinct tells me bad things will happen. I react to it as such, and then I adjust for being positive.
Joe Anthony is very stoic in his approach to life.
I am. It made me feel better reading this article, though, because I thought that cynicism was going to get me killed. Like, it would just poison me. But apparently, according to this article, cynics generally have more stable marriages. They earn more money if they're self-employed over optimists who are self-employed. And they live longer if they are more pessimistic about their future and their future satisfactions.
See, I would think the positive person would have the better marriages.
Yeah,
wouldn't you?
You would imagine so. Who wants to live with a miserable cuss?
Yeah, and make more money and all. I think it would be the exact opposite.
Well, what I could find is cynics are more realistic about their chances. So both with marriage and with money, They're more realistic about. I mean, they believe the worst will happen, so they plan for it.
They measure more and they prepare more, so they last longer. Makes sense.
Right. So when the worst happens in a marriage, when they run into rocky times or they run out of money, they've planned for it because they are a cynic, apparently.
Or they don't set a standard of so everything's okay, when in real life, it's tough times for everybody. It rains on everybody the same.
Right. There's a quote from Psychology and Aging that I'd like to read. It's a quote: "Survival analysis revealed that in later adulthood, underestimating one's satisfaction 5 years later was related to lower hazard ratios for disability and mortality across 10 or more years, even after controlling for age, sex, education, income, and self-rated health." Meaning, be cynical and you will not expect as much, and you'll be happier with what you get. But again, that comes with a lot of self-awareness. Don't be like Dr. House, that level of cynical, that's just miserable. But there is a line between self-aware cynical and being a miserable bastard.
And just from being a blind optimist, too.
Right. One last thing from this same article, the BBC article. According to this, habitual good moods can sap your drive, because if you're in a good mood all the time, apparently it makes you more gullible and potentially selfish. And we're not going to get into that too much. That we'll save that for our happiness or goodness episode, where we're focusing on evil today. But there is apparently a negative side to being positive all the time. And it's not a big negative. You will, again, live a happier life and potentially healthier. It's just there are a couple benefits to being a kook or a crank. So do you want to get back to our man, Joseph Hatch?
I want to take you on this journey here. He went out, he bought a 45-ton, the name of the boat was an Awaro. And like I talked to you about before, there were seasons to this. You couldn't just go hunt whenever you wanted. So but our villain here, our CEO jerk here, he didn't like to follow the rules. He didn't think the rule applied to him. They were just kind of inconvenient. So the street name, they started calling behind his back. The rower started being called the Poacher. That's what it was referred to by. So everybody knew what he was up to.
So his first boat, like his first real investment, it already has a villain name.
Right, exactly.
That's starting pretty early.
So he went to Macquarie Island and he put gangs of his people out there, and they were hunting elephant bulls and the way they're supposed to be doing the whaling and that. But it just didn't work out. It wasn't economic success. In the first year, they only extracted 10 tons of oil, and it cost them more than that to have all that labor and work out there.
Okay.
So when he brought the idea of the penguins thing, the town people were absolutely disgusted. They were not interested in that. So he didn't care about the social pressure. He had like 7 kids, and he was very involved in the community. So he just didn't give a shit what other people thought.
I so want to be there for that town meeting. I mean, like, when the crazy guy who is, like, known as a supervillain and has a boat named the Poacher.
Right, with this whip-thin body, and I guess he had this herky-jerky way he talked, and this crazed blue eyes. I mean, of just,
oh my God.
Just says greed.
And him standing up and saying, I have an idea. Just imagine everyone just like everyone just like shut up. Let's listen to this. Let's hear this. We have to hear this.
This was pre-TV, you know.
I know that would have been amazing. So they didn't go for it. Like the town did not want him boiling penguins.
No, this man people fought against him his whole life. I mean, this is a guy who had a tough time of it.
And when he dropped people off these expeditions, it's not like he was stepping off the boat onto the ice with a gun, shooting, and then getting back on board. It was like landing on the moon. They had to like drop these guys off, right?
It was a huge investment of men, power, and money.
Okay.
It was a big thing, yeah, and they had a lot of money invested. It was big business, much like probably Willing is today. It's not cheap to go out there and do that.
I don't know why, but I foolishly imagined that this would be kind of like a story from like the Up and Comers or like the Gladwell's book about like Jewish communities getting together and starting factories for textiles. I thought this was going to be a slow progression.
Oh no!
Where Joseph Hatch skinned a cat once, found out he was good at it, and then went up from there. This is immediately starting with, let's go take a boat and just destroy wildlife
and just make money.
Well, if you've got a plan, just start whole hog, I guess.
It's funny because he saw this island and saw how rich it was in just marine life when he was like 26. And just so you know, this continues right up until his late 80s.
Yeah.
So he had this vision of evil. Couldn't he think of something better? He's obviously a smart guy.
Yeah. His childhood mobile, like above him spinning in his head, must have been like headless penguins and like flipperless seals and stuff.
He's just a sick fuck,
So, do we want to talk about whether or not we actually make more money being evil?
Do the bad guys, the villainous, do they make more money?
This is the one that I wanted answered for myself. I wanted to know how evil do I have to be to make money?
Do I have to be more evil to make $1 million or 100,000? Right.
Right. Yeah. We're really. I'm not going to speak for Todd, but we're really getting into personal. For me, this was the big question of my life because I have a hippie father. And he used to tell me that evil people are rich people. Like the rich people are just evil by nature. And then he also told me that aliens exist. You can mentally control clouds. Like he really, really, when I say hippie, it's like almost, I'm surprised he didn't go in a cult somewhere and like try to join the Comets. Like,
he probably lost some credibility with some of his stuff, but some of his stuff he was dead on, right?
A little bit. Oh my. We'll save the trees and how trees can talk to each other, and then me having to come to him admit after reading about Amanita fungus later that they actually are in some level of communication.
Joe, that's our childhood trauma episode.
It is, yeah. Oh, we have a whole episode. That's going to be a season or a whole new podcast. So we're gonna answer that old. My dad is going to listen to this and he'll be pumping his fist. He'll be like, I was right. So yeah, Dad, you were right. Rich people are kind of evil. We're going to go from an article by Wired. This is a fantastic article by Christopher Ryan. Why are rich people so mean? And if you want to pause this episode and then read it and come back, you can do that, or just read it later. It's a fantastic read. What they focus on here is first they give us like a anecdotal story. So we're going to start with that because I thought that was a great way to analyze the meanness or evilness of rich people. So Christopher here talks about a guy who was working in California, Hal Steger, who had a net worth of about $3.5 million. And he was ready to retire with his wife and live off of $175K a year. He figured at his point in life, when he was 51, that he could retire early, and it would be a glorious life. Like literally, his annual salary would be half of a house in the Pacific Northwest, so he was going to be fine. But instead, he didn't retire. He stayed on, and he continued to work 12 hours a day, and 10 hours on the weekends. And when asked why he chose not to retire, he said a few million doesn't go as far as it used to. That was his reason why. Kind of a similar story with Gary Kremen, the founder of Match.com, who's worth $10 million, so he's worth more than double Hal Steger. And he said to the press, everyone around here looks at the people above them. You're nobody here at 10 million. So as he's going around, as Christopher Ryan is going around interviewing these guys who are worth enough money to where they should never have to work again, they're looking to the people above them and saying, I'm not worth that much, really. And they're comparing themselves. I mean, that's kind of the same way we've talked about this, right? With like Hollywood and cars. Like if you park your Porsche next to even more rare cars, you don't have as much by comparison.
Absolutely. And then the millionaires are looking at their lifestyle and saying, but I can't do what the billionaires do. Not even close.
Right.
I'm a joke. I'm at the kids' table here.
Right. Yeah. Comparatively, how am I really doing? I have a yacht, sure, but I don't have that private jet yet. We're making light of it.
And you see that in athletics and academics, if you only have a bachelor's, and you eventually wish you had your master's or PhD. And you feel inferior to those people.
That is an absolutely perfect way to look at this argument. That quickly grounds us. Because everybody listening, me included, we're like, oh yeah, private jet versus yacht, they can both kill themselves. Who cares? A bunch of rich people, we don't have sympathy for them.
But if your core value is being an entrepreneur and making money, that would be important to you.
That's a great measure.
Because it's a measurable thing, yeah.
But you're absolutely right. I, as an academic, I compare my credentials to other academics. If your real value is how much money you make to your neighbor, then that matters. Like if you have an 18-hour-a-day job and then your neighbor makes $2 more, you compare. You have to. So in Ryan's article, he says, why are these guys such a-holes once they break $1 million? Does being a villain earn you money, or does the money turn you into a villain? So it's the chicken or the egg. Ryan has a story where he talks about how he went to India. And he has the story in the article that I'm suggesting you read. And he shows up, and he's on this business trip. And he is being begged for money in the streets. Like he's sitting in a diner, and kids are coming up to him with their hands out.
Starving kids,
yeah. I mean, they're not being rude, overly rude. They are legit starving. As soon as he's done eating, they're going to come up to the table and grab whatever he leaves. They're going to eat it. And my uncle visited in India on he worked in telecommunications, and he said the same thing. He's like, it's everyone. It's completely, it's part of the street. And Chris Ryan talks about how he had to learn how to insulate himself, because when you're seeing that, he said that any American would realize that their car could buy a school here, or that it would fund the college and the full education from being, a poor starving kid to a high schooler, just with what your house is worth. There's degrees of poverty. So what he says is he had to callus himself. Sitting there at the diner, he realized that he would have to walk away. Like he could give them money, he could give them his food, he could consider, funding school or donations. But at some point, you do have to walk away.
Because you can't help everybody.
Right. So what money really does to you, it doesn't so much insulate you as it isolates you by force. For me, example, if I had enough money, I would get out of... I have a great living situation. I have nothing to complain about. But with more money, I would live in a place that doesn't have as many roommates. And further from there, if I had even more money after that, I would live in a cabin in the woods.
Let's say you could get a bigger house further away from
right,
people.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not even a negative thing that money isolates you. You do it for comfort. Everyone does. So it forces you to callous yourself. You get away from bad neighborhoods. You ignore beggars. You ignore bad proposals. I mean, if you're starting to make money, if you really have a lot of money, people will come up to you with business proposals or savings proposals or investments. And that's not just in a business sense. People do it when it's like in your real life, in your everyday life, people will come up to you.
But then you see everybody who has a job and works in a corporate environment has that, I want to go work for myself and get out of here and get away from everybody.
How many times does like a cousin or a stepbrother come to you and say, I've got an investment that you're going to be interested in, and it turns out to be a pyramid scheme or something.
And the richer you get, they get more creative and more of them.
Yes.
You got to start saying no and getting calloused.
Right. So what I'm saying is that everybody listening to this podcast on an electronic device, you've already started the isolation and the callousing yourself. We just haven't gone as far as somebody truly wealthy has. I want to share with you a couple of fun studies, if you don't mind, and these are about wealth and how starting with money can affect your brain. So there's a New York State Psychiatric Institute study that talked about how rich people are more likely to walk out of stores with merchandise they hadn't purchased. And it was just a general study. They just want to see if the whole there's a myth that poor people steal more often, or that they're doing it because they're hungry, or that they steal because they feel like there's an entitlement because you're poor, like the world owes me because I can't afford this. That's apparently not true. Wealthy people are actually more likely to walk out with stuff they haven't purchased because they feel entitled, because they've been regulars there. They feel like it's almost like a coupon discount. Like, I have spent $900 here this week. I deserve the $10 item for free.
Well, and I have something on this that just leads to this. I used to be in copier sales for some years, and there is a joke in the industry, and it's about two industries: people who own car dealerships and dentists, which are two of the more lucrative entrepreneurial things to have. Both of those groups of people don't think they should have to pay for things.
Right.
They have that in common. They're the highest earning, and they pay their bills late, or they just feel like they don't have to pay them at all. It kind of is right up that alley.
Yeah. You and I have anecdotally talked about how celebrities eventually stop having to pay for anything. The more you become a personality well known, the more people want to do for you to put your name on their resume. So you eventually become so isolated by wealth that you really actually stop having to react like a person. You don't have to consider what things will cost you quite so much. There was another study looking at how much people contribute as far as compared to taxes. So the other myth we want to bust is wealthy people contribute more. That they're to society, they give more.
They save like no other, and they give like everybody else. What's that Dave Ramsey says?
Oh, I hadn't heard that. That's a good quote. It's not true, but it's a good quote. It may be true for Dave Ramsey. But they found, this is a study by Independent Sectors, which is a nonprofit coalition. They found out incomes below $25,000 a year gave away 4% of their income, whereas those earning $150K or more a year donated 2.7. So that's 4% versus 2.7. So it's not a giant gap. But it's still significant because
Sure.
The higher that amount goes and the lower their percentage donation drops, the more of a difference you're looking at, the more significantly that means.
And they have more expendable income from being over that.
Absolutely. Higher earners become blind to suffering. From UCLA, they pick up less on facial cues. Rich people are less generous than the poor, according to the University of Toronto. This is a study by Stephanie Coate and her colleagues. But they think the distance created by wealth, it's the differentials that break the flow of human kindness. So when we talk about sitting at a cafe in India, having kids come up to you and having to eventually walk away, that you can give out money, you can literally hand them money, but it will never really be enough. From this study, Stephanie Coate, her colleagues talk about this, where they think that higher income, I'm going to quote the article actually so I don't get this wrong, quote, higher income individuals are only less generous if they reside in highly unequal areas or when inequality is experimentally portrayed as relatively high. So that means if you're a rich American sitting in a cafe in India, that's a high inequality. That's one of the wealthiest people on earth sitting next to the most poor people on earth. Same thing in America. If you are in a city that has bad upward mobility and you're surrounded by poverty and impoverished people, you're going to become isolated. You're going to become calloused. You have to. Your brain has to be able to do that.
Protect itself.
It protects itself. It protects its own narrative. Lastly, and this is the funnest one, I saved the most amusing study for last. And I apologize, I'm fire hosing all of these studies at you, Todd, but they all contributed, and they're all presented in this Wired article.
So much information, Joe.
Yeah. Well,
Joe doesn't know when to stop the research bud sometimes.
I don't, and that's how I live. So just to recap real quickly, rich people are more likely to walk out with products they haven't paid for. They donate slightly less percent-wise to their taxes. They're more blind to facial cues of people in poverty. And the greater the difference, the more likely they are to start becoming calloused. Our last study comes from UC Berkeley. And this was a famous experiment called the Monopoly experiment, ran by Keltner and Piff. You'll notice in our docs I don't have any notes on this because I had read this enough times to where I just enjoyed talking about it at this point. So if you and I sat down and we started playing Monopoly, and I hand you extra money, extra dice, and I let you take multiple turns to start with, how do you think you would feel about your advantage when we start the game? Would you feel it was unfair?
Yeah, I think so. I have an advantage.
Okay. Over the course of a game, how much do you feel you would be bragging during the game? You think you'd be like bumping your fist that you're winning, or would you feel bad about winning?
I'd probably feel pretty good about it.
Okay. This was they did multiple groups. There was a lot of people involved in the study. And what they found was one of the tests they did is they would do this. They would give one person playing Monopoly all the advantages on Earth starting the game. And then they would let them play through the game, and they would bring out pretzels. And they put a bowl of pretzels in the middle of the table, and they would let people take them as much as they want. And the person who was winning, who had all these advantages to start out, they did nothing to earn it. They just had it. They had the money, they had the extra dice, they had the extra turns. Those people took more pretzels than anyone else.
And you think they'd spread it around, right?
Right. But they ate more at the table. They showed more bragging. They over time, at the end of the game, they would test them and ask them, how do you feel about your performance? How did you win? And the people who started out with the advantage, they didn't talk about how they had started with an advantage.
They didn't even acknowledge that.
They would sometimes acknowledge it, but by and large, they would mostly talk about their skill and their ability, and sometimes their luck.
Oh, boy.
So we
That's insulting.
It feels oh my god, if you were one of the other people at the table, I would be screaming at that point. Like, they're interviewing the guy who took the extra turns. I'd be in the background just being like, no. I would throw pretzels at them for bragging. But no, that's a mechanism of humans. That's not something to be sad about. That is, give us an advantage, we will find reasons why we earned that. And it's just a mechanism to protect our psyche.
So it's a process to justify.
It is.
Why we deserve.
Because we don't want to feel like a villain sitting there surrounded by poor Indian kids who need food at that moment. We need to be able to justify why we earned what we have.
That's great. Well, the executive producer here, Joanne, she's from the Philippines, and she told me this story. And you always hear stories about Americans retiring to the Philippines. And they say, hey, I can live here for $500 a month. It's great. I have a house on the beach. You've heard these people, right?
Yeah.
And Joanne said, yeah, that's true. As long as you don't mind seeing starving babies looking at you every single day.
Right.
And so when she's telling me this, I go, oh, that'd be horrible. I go, so they're just like out there in their diapers, with their hands out. She goes, diapers? There's no diapers. And then that to me really registered what callous and what true poverty is. Kids
Right.
don't have diapers even.
Yeah, that is... I can't think of a better example to illustrate all of these points. That is a perfect story, and that's dead on. It's Yeah, we Americans sometimes take their advantages to other countries, and that's exactly what it feels like.
But I've never heard one of them come back and say anything beyond the beautiful women they hang out, the food they ate, their house on the beach.
Right.
I've never heard them talk about the horrors that they see because they've obviously calloused themselves to it. And
Right, they played that Monopoly. They took their extra turns and their extra money, and then they talk about how they've done with it. So, we can all become the villain. That's a horrible... I don't like that that's the takeaway from this, that we can become the villain, but...
and it's okay. It's natural.
Right. Not only is it we can become the villain, but our brains are built to over time if we go to extreme differences. But because Hatch was such a villain so early, he didn't get to start with the Monopoly tokens. So... How did his political career go? How did he justify all this, the boiling of animals?
Okay, our villain CEO here of the penguin oil industry, he started out as a pharmacist. He opened his own pharmacist in town. Then he became a town member. He started the town's Chamber of Commerce. Then he was the city's postmaster. And then he worked in other departments in the clean water and the gas division. But then he became the mayor, and he peaked as a member of the House of Representatives. And that was at age 47. So from the age 26, he went from a pharmacy to running all these different civil groups to mayor and then House of Representatives.
So he literally worked his way all through town. Like every job in town he could have had.
He did. And he's a smart guy, an expert in everything. So I'm sure he made a lot of contacts.
In my mind, just please tell me that like cats and dogs went missing everywhere he went.
It didn't say that he started a humane society.
Okay.
A PetSmart adoption event.
Wherever he went, just animals disappeared.
I know. I'm thinking. That's what I was thinking about this thing. You could pretty much grind anything into oil.
Right. So he became mayor at some point.
He was mayor. Yep. So that gave him some political power. Again, he had his supporters. As hated as he was, and I think this stands true today, these people who we see as, why are they even born? 50% of the people still think, believe in them.
I think success is attractive, and not in just the idea that they will give you their table scraps. I think seeing somebody successful makes you think they've got a plan, that they something they're doing. I mean, do you get that sense when you read about successful people?
I think so. It seems like, exactly what he said. It's about 50-50. And you look at any politician, and let's say you're the president of the United States or president of any country, half of your country usually doesn't like you.
Yeah.
They loathe you. They say things about you. They protest against you. And that's if you're one.
Yeah. And then the other half and me say, let's hear him out.
You just like to see a good car accident, that's all.
Well, that's the side I'm on, yeah. I'm on the side of the car accident or the train wreck. So what did he do after mayor? When did we get into the penguins?
Well, now he denied any plans. He was out poaching on his boat, the Poacher.
Okay.
And he denied that he was poaching seals. But then he got exposed. So most of the people hissed and booed him when he'd go up and speak. So he actually lost his political power. He lost his House Representative seats. So from doing his business illegally, he got kicked out of office.
Oh, okay. So there were actual repercussions to poaching.
20 years later.
Okay.
And just because he couldn't do his day job and this. I mean, the guy's ambitious.
Right.
I mean, he's out killing whales, that he's running office, and he's got businesses. A busy guy.
That's like me being mayor and stealing car stereos, and then somebody calling me on it 20 years later, just being like, what do you mean? I didn't know I couldn't do this.
It's like they can't fill that tank of greed. Like, how much do you really need? It's kind of what you were talking about earlier.
I need to be able to control town and poach.
So the London Zoology Society started to demand a change. They'd send photographers out that was very powerful, and some reports were made. and a lot of the scientists have gotten involved in what the long-term loss was going to be. And the king penguin, they made this report, and this is, quote, "The king penguin draws near the end of its history. Let me tell you how history is closing. These birds are being murdered wholesale for their oil. Parties of men land and club them upon their nest, from which the poor silly things refuse to stir. The dead and stunned, the living and dead together, are dragged away and thrust into iron crates to be boiled down for their oil." So this being reported is disgusting. You can see just pounds of some live penguins, some dead penguins, and mangled, and they're just saying this is enough. And they also did the math on that they're flirting with an extinction, and they need to save these animals. And then when you start seeing the photos with these cute little penguins, it was time for change, and the London Zoology Society demanded it.
Okay, that seems to be, to me, whenever I read articles about this, public opinion matters. That actually, when all the public wants something, that's when change really actually starts to occur.
And I think when people start to see it, the visualize made a big deal too.
Yeah.
When it's just happening over on an island and it's a public debate, it's one thing. But we know the power of, visual symbols and how our news is today.
Right. You see a picture and you hear a narrative, and it actually has an effect.
And it gets the emotional side, the nerve.
So, theoretical, I don't actually have this, but if I had an actual penguin here in your house, how much money for you to boil it?
No amount of
money. If I had a stack of cash, like $1 million, would you boil a penguin?
No, you've seen how we treat our $5 free cat we have.
That's true. Yeah, that is true.
It eats better than we do. It sleeps in a king size bed.
that
we'd make we put ice in the tub. We'd make a little Sea World for this penguin.
That's right. The penguin would own the house by the end of it. Okay, well, I probably wouldn't boil a penguin too. Maybe enough money.
I was gonna say $1,500.
Yeah, 15. Just give me $15. I'll boil a penguin.
I don't know this penguin,
Yeah, how much money do I owe the penguin? So the reason I ask that question is we always want to ask the question: can we reform? Like, could we have taken Joseph Hatch and walked him aside and turned him into a good person again? How can this callousing of rich and wealthy people, can we uncallous someone? Can we remind somebody of their humanity and get them to not act evil? I guess callous isn't evil, but generally Joseph Hatch was pretty evil. And the answer that I found delightedly is yes, you can totally reform people. All you have to do is re-expose them to a social atmosphere that is equitable. That's all challenging, but I'll start to break that down. We're going to go through some more experiments in science here. They did a test once to see who was most, cautious on the road or more aware of other people, where they had people step off the sidewalk. They would make eye contact with the driver. They'd step off the sidewalk, and they were measuring to see which drivers would ignore them purposefully and just breeze past them, like not let them walk. Can you guess what type of car people drove that were the worst drivers?
It's sports cars.
Sports cars. That's a good answer. Yeah, like Porsches and stuff. Think more luxury and more wealthy.
The Mercedes, BMWs.
Boom. It was BMW drivers. So if you know someone who drives a BMW, do not step in front of them while they're driving. They will run you over.
They're calloused pricks.
If you know someone who drives a BMW, look this study up on the internet. It's just write BMW car test or sidewalk test, and you'll have fodder or ammunition to throw at them at your next dinner party. So we're going to talk about how to uncallous people. This is, again, another study from UC Berkeley by the same team. They invented a game where participants who showed the greatest generosity with their money, benefited from the respect of their peers, and they got cooperation when they were given social influence. So to phrase that differently, the game rewarded them socially instead of with money. So the more generous they were during the game, the more control they had, the more people listened to them, the more social rewards there were. And I'm going to quote their findings here. Quote, "The findings suggest that anyone who acts only in his or her narrow self-interest will be shunned, disrespected, and even hated. But those who behave generously with others are held in high esteem by their peers and thus rise in status." This just shows that there's more social status and generosity than there is in money, and it totally worked. Like, just the simple game made them more generous. It made them want the status of social status more than they wanted the money status. And this kind of crosses countries, too. In any country that we look at where money isn't held as much of a status symbol, people don't care about it nearly as much. Social status and respect are really what humans crave as people. It's just that we show that affirmation to people with wealth here in America. So if you have wealth here in America, you get the respect and you get the social status. There was another study that reinforced this, that kind of backed it up for me. They showed people, or primed them, study participants, with a 46-second video about childhood poverty. And they had them document their wealth, so they knew which participants were rich and how many of them were poor. Rich participants, rich subjects, who were willing to help a stranger who appeared in distress in the lab, they were willing to help way more often after watching this video. So just seeing a video that shows them social need somewhere else in the world made them willing to help somebody who was in the lab with them, who was struggling with something, who needed help.
So that's a transformation. That's a quick one.
That's
46 seconds.
46 seconds.
They've been living 46 years greedy, and they see this.
Right. So that's from the same article, the same Wired article, Why Are Rich People So Mean? They bring up all these studies. And that really just tells me that all we need in life to reform anyone who is wealthy and quote-unquote evil, or who has isolated themselves, all you need to do is remind them that we value social leaders. We value and respect people who are generous.
And I've seen this in my Christian life in the church, where there's people who will be ruthless in their business practices and just the way they live their life. But at church, they will give to raise their status in the church.
I can't think of a better example of this, but that's exactly right.
Another one that popped into my head was the multi-billionaires from the Industrial Revolution of Rockefeller and Carnegie. They would do anything coming up to make money, to become who they were, to get the power. They didn't care about child labor laws. They didn't care about anything. They had their workers die.
Pouring molten iron on people by accident. Yeah.
That's what they said. And in their factories, there wasn't a gray hair on anybody because you didn't live that long. But those same two men, towards the end of their life, they gave away money more quicker than they did making it, and more competitively.
Right.
To get that status, to get the Carnegie libraries and the Rockefeller centers. So that's right what you're talking about.
And those two guys were in direct competition with each other, too. So I remember one very brief anecdote about they would send each other gifts, and they were always like digs. Like, they were always jokes.
Yeah, because Rockefeller was a non-drinking Presbyterian, so he'd send him a bottle of booze.
Yeah, and then Carnegie, I think he sent Carnegie, because he came up poor, he sent him like a paper vest. So they were in it for the status. But you're right, they gave, and that. But
with their names on the buildings, and you can see it. This is exactly what you're talking about.
Rockefeller Center, the Carnegie, it's exactly right.
But 20 years earlier, they didn't care about the factory worker who died and had a family who was homeless and starving now.
Right. Yeah, there wasn't a lot of social status to be won at that point. So, speaking of social status and radical change, How did the public campaign against Hatch go? Like how? I mean, we want to see a villain fall. We didn't start this podcast. We weren't going to end with, and Joseph Hatch lived prosperly ever after boiling penguins. So how did things eventually turn?
Things started to come. All the walls started to cave in on him, and they actually started. They did. The Sydney Morning Herald did a look into his license, and turned out that his license was null and void. So he was doing all this poaching, and he didn't have the right to be doing that.
Okay.
So all the government agencies all came down on him at once. So he put his whole life into, instead of boiling penguins and selling the oil, which he made a lot of money for a long time, he was out trying to clear his name. He's in his 80s now.
So he wanted the social respect more than he wanted.
Yeah. Speech after speech. He had a lot of government people still in his pocket, but they wanted blood. They wanted him gone.
They wanted him in a vat.
Yeah. Cruelty became kind of a soft spot to people. It's kind of what you're talking about with the 46-second video. Mm-hmm. When they started seeing these poor penguins being killed and started seeing pictures of them, it just became uncool to penguin kill.
Right. And that social pressure of everybody, the public turning against him, it sounds like the governments had to act after that.
He did. Now, he lost some commercial property. His sons had to they were in save mode. You know, there was all these leaks in the boat. So they're trying to take money from this and put out. So his whole fortune went back to the city, and it was all gone.
Okay.
And on his deathbed, now the man lived, this nasty cuss, to the ripe old age at 91. And he didn't just die and have a heart attack or get hit by a train or whatever happened in those days. He just kind of wasted away. So his family was there taking care of him. But at the end of it, he wasn't in a big mansion, waterfront, having his own island. He was living in a tiny cottage with his family around him on a pension of about $1.50 a week.
Okay.
Which I don't think is very much. I don't know the inflation rate.
I don't think that was ever much. So I feel
even in Roman times.
Yeah.
So the gist of it was he was broke.
Okay. Well, at least him dying at 91 backs up our study about cynics live longer.
Well, at the end, a reporter came to see him for his last thing. And they said he still had that wild look in his eye, you know. So it was really, their spirit's a real thing. I'm convinced by this guy.
Yeah.
Only the good die young.
Well, then we need to turn cynical real quick.
Now I have a theory, Joe. This is just from my research and my reading. I think the family were circling around him at the end just to see what was left over.
Oh.
But the very last property he only had one thing left to will, and it was still the oil property. He willed it to them, but he told them they weren't allowed to sell it. That was so he still believed in it, even after all this negative publicity.
That's like a curse. I mean, it shows his naive belief that, like, we will boil penguins again, but it's also a curse on the family, basically.
And so you know that those daughters were probably thinking of taking the pillow and putting it right over his head. So you son of a bitch.
Right. As he's signing.
I would have killed you 2 years ago if I knew that you were going to will me something I can't sell, has no value.
Oh my God! There would be bagpipes playing as I lowered him in a vat. Like it would be
a rusted vat and digest him.
Right. What a miserable cuss.
It might surprise you, but cynicism and anger, the hallmarks of villainy, can totally pay off. Anger can aid you in your decision making, making you more discriminatory against bad information. And not repressing anger can have health benefits, both against cancer and hypertension. Cynics can experience more stable relationships, make more money, and generally live longer. But you don't necessarily need to become miserable old cuss to achieve these things. Because the binding theme of Cynics and Cranks is this: allow your emotions to be recognized and expressed in healthy ways. Be realistic with yourself and with your expectations. And yes, if you've ever suspected that rich people are assholes, it's true. Study after study has shown that wealthy earners callous themselves, isolate themselves, and get used to saying no as a requisite to having wealth at all. Rich people can become blind to social cues, become less generous with their donations, and have a tendency to blame their good fortune or their inheritance on their own skills and smarts instead of luck. But we have to keep something in mind. This callousness isn't a rich condition. It's a human condition. It's an internal defense, a way to make sense of our absurdly good fortune in a world where extreme poverty exists. And we know this because the calluses formed by the wealthy against the poor form quickest in areas of extreme inequality. And like Scrooge, these calluses are reversible. Nobody wants to think of themselves as a villain, not even our penguin killer Joseph Hatch, who lived to the ripe old age of 91, still defending his practice of boiling penguins, still trying to keep his oil enterprise afloat, still surrounded by family and pictures of his sailboats. You've been listening to Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week.
You can connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com, where we have research links, show notes, and blog articles for each episode. We also appreciate feedback, and we love spirited debates.
We are not experts in anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.
Now, speaking of opinions, I have one of our very first show corrections. Now, I'm sure we're going to have more of these, but a correction from our last episode, if everybody was listening. We mentioned that functional MRIs, we use that study, and we also mentioned hormones like oxytocin in relation to pets and whether or not they actually love us. Just as a correction, I was reading from two studies there, and I forgot to mention that, so I made it sound like functional MRIs can measure hormones. That's not the case. Those were two different studies. So I forgot to cite those. Also, speaking of not being experts.
So we're sorry, we're not vets, but we're getting better.
Yeah. No, that was a case of mishandling the citation, not so much the information. Also, Todd, do you want to read a review for this episode?
Look at iTunes 5-star reviews from Kaylee Allen. Very helpful and informative. Two dynamic voices helping you navigate through some of the more difficult mindsets in life. Highly appreciate this podcast and the self-help it offers. Almost like therapy. Thanks, Kaylee Allen. Very
Almost
cool.
Like therapy. I like that. Thank you, Kaylee, very much.
We really appreciate it. We work very hard on this show, and we love our listeners.
And if any of you want to leave a review on iTunes, we will eventually get to reading it. So go ahead and drop it in there if you have time.
And we will read the bad ones, too. We'll laugh at those.
Oh, I can't wait for the 1 stars.